Let's go to number 2, impairment. Let's go to number 2, impairment. So what's an impairment? Now I'll just say right up front, there's a lot of categories that give you money in an injury award, right? But it revolves around 2. There's 2 whopper subjects that will determine the injury award and the amount. There's 2. Anybody want to take a chance? Number 1 is impairment. How much of an injury award are you going to have if you don't have a permanent injury? Not much, right? So the first criteria to put you into a larger injury award category is an impairment injury, right? You attorneys know this, right? Okay. What's the second part of the equation that increases that injury award? It's like a 1-2 punch for the financial injury award. Impairment with what? It's the core of personal injury. No. Close. Wrong word. How it restricts or limits what's most important to that individual, and that's called what? Activities of daily living. That's why people get paid. That's where all the money's at. Do you have a permanent injury, and is it limiting or restricting me doing from something that's darn important in my life? Who agrees with that? Attorneys, you agree with that? That's the big enchilada right there, okay? All right, so here we go. We're on number 2. We're on impairment. How much of an impairment do you get for cervical sprain strain? 0. 0. How much of an impairment do you get for altered intersegmental? Remember, it's as much as 80% of the time. And what's the impairment that you get for altered intersegmental spinal motion?
28.
For ALMSI, it's 25% whole body impairment. Whole body, 25. Altered intersegmental spinal motion. Remember, altered intersegmental, remember here it is, normal first. Altered intersegmental is the first part of the disease process. And then as it gets worse, it's called ALMSI. 1, 2, 3. If you think of it that simple. Okay? So when we go ALMSI, the worst case scenario, you get a 25% impairment rating. Altered intersegmental motion is a percentage of that 25. So I'll measure altered intersegmental motion. And is it 50% of 1 millimeter to 3.5 millimeters? By the way, this is exactly how it's explained in a narrative report to a jury. This is exactly what a jury hears. This is how I got that number for altered intersegmental motion. Well, I got 25% from the guides for ALMSI, which is a more severe part of that pathology. And I'll just measure it and I go, well, is it 50%? Is the measurement 50% from 1 millimeter to 3.5? If it's 50%, I'll give them 55% of the 25% impairment. How much sense does that make? If it's 25% of the measurement, I'll give them 25% of the 25 whole body impairment. If the measurement is 75%, I'll give them 75% of 25% whole body impairment. How much sense did that make? How much sense would that make to a jury? You get my point? That's how altered intersegmental motion, and that's why I say it's either 25% of, 50% of, or 75% of 25%. What determines whether it's 25% of the measurement? Is it a more severe or less severe case? That's it. And remember, what percentage of the time is this case found on an x-ray when it's done properly?
80.
Over 80% of the time. 80% of the time. So, let me show you this. This is right out of the AMA guides. It's in the back of your book. This is right out of the AMA guides, page 392, table 5.3, cervical spine. It has columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It has 5 columns, left to right. Go to the 4th column over, and you see what it says at the top there? Cervical category 4, 25 to 28% impairment, whole person. You see what that first sentence says right there? Alteration of motion segment integrity. Right out of the MA guides, right there. Not my opinion. How valuable, by the way, is a 25% impairment rating for an injury award? Little or lot?
Huge.
It's big. It's big. Lumbar spine. LMSI, altered intersegmental motion in the lumbar spine. 20 to 23% whole body. 20 to 23% whole body. Okay? Now, remember when I started, I said most attorneys don't pay a whole lot of attention to soft tissue injuries and are happy to get an MRI with a disc. Remember I said that? And I said the attorney typically is losing out on half the potential injury award. They're typically walking away when they submit their injury award for a disc injury with an MRI. They don't know it, but they're walking away from half of the potential injury award. And let me give you a little example why right now. You see this graph right here? Table 15.7. This is the 5th edition of the MA Guide. If you pull down here to number 2, it says intervertebral disc. And if you go to B, on the left column it says cervical, on the right column it says lumbar. Those are numbers that represent an impairment for the cervical disc and the lumbar spine, cervical spine and lumbar spine. Do you see what that number says? What's the cervical impairment for a disc in the lumbar spine? 4%, with no residuals. Lumbar spine, 5%. And the attorney is going wild and crazy that he's got an MRI and a disc injury, and you're so satisfied with your 4% or your 5%, and yet you probably, oh, and by the way, if you have a disc injury, right, that's a soft tissue injury. If you have a disc bulge, what's the likelihood that that's affecting how those two vertebrae are moving? That it's made it a little more unstable. Called what? Altered intersegmental spinal motion, or LMSI. So guess what the diagnosis should have, the leading diagnosis in the injury award should have been? LMSI, or altered intersegmental spinal motion, as the primary, disc is the secondary, because of what I just showed you. LMSI gives a 25% impairment. You can almost bet if somebody has a disc bulge, they have LMSI. You can almost, it's like, it's the same thing, it's the same anatomy. But you're satisfied with a 4% impairment, disc bulge, MRI, and you don't have LMSI documented anywhere. And by the way, it's not your fault. It's not the attorney's fault at all. Why? There's only one thing you can do. Can you change or request or order a diagnostic test? Can you evaluate a patient? No, you're an attorney. You're not a doctor. So it's not your fault. Most attorneys that I found are in a state of what's called unconscious incompetence. Like in here, you don't even know what you don't know. How many here never even heard of the word before? Altered intersegmental spinal motion or alteration of motion segment integrity, and you've been in practice 38 years. Is it your fault? No. Who should have educated him on that? He went to law school. He didn't go to medical school. It'd be like holding me responsible. I'm a chiropractor. It'd be like holding me responsible for the specifics of a brief. I don't know anything about a brief, right? That's not what I went to school for. I'm not licensed for it. Who should have taught him? The doctors he's working with. So you only have one option as an attorney to correct this, which is what? Work with the right doctor that knows how to diagnose it. Because the doctor who doesn't know how to diagnose it and give you the cervical sprain strain, how much money is he costing you in lost revenue? It's costing you way more than what you realize. So most attorneys I found are totally satisfied with a disc injury. And by the way, there's more to it. We're only covering one category. There's 10 categories. We're only on the second one. And I found most attorneys are totally satisfied with a positive MR and a disc. They're like, I'll be glad to get $20,000 or $30,000. I'm like, you don't understand. You probably just walked away from a policy limit award, because I'll just tell you, just from a clinical experience, You got a disc bulge on an MRI, you got all 10 of these categories fulfilled. You got like 90, 95%. You got all 10 of these categories. If you have a doctor that knows how to document it. You don't have just one. You don't just have the impairment. You got all 10 of them. We'll go through and you'll see. But that's why I say most attorneys are walking away from 50% of the money because they're okay with a 4% impairment with a disc and an MRI because they don't have doctors who know how to document altered intersegmental spinal motion, alteration of motion segment integrity, how to give it an impairment rating, and how to do all these other categories. So you're stuck. You're stuck. So here you are. You got your cervical sprain strain. You're 0 for 2 now. These are the 10 categories. And remember, the top 5 build the money. And it's in order of priority of money. The most money here is second here. So right now, if you're not getting these diagnoses at least 8 out of 10 times, you're 0 for 2. So you're 0 for 2 in the top 2 financial driver categories. Where's the needle pointing with your injury award? No offer, low ball offer, high ball offer, policy limit award. Where's the needle pointing for you right now?
2, low ball.
It's not looking good, is it? It's not looking good. And this is why you get stuck with low ball offers. Remember I said before you walked in here, you're going to know exactly what's causing low ball offers and how to stop it before you walk out of here? You see how that's starting to happen right now? You know the top 2 reasons right now why you're getting stuck with low ball offers. I've got 8 more to go. All right, let's go back to the next one. Loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities and duties under duress. I'm going to put those together. I'm going to put them together. Okay. How many of you have ever had a form come across your desk from the doctor's documentation that said loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities? Raise your hand. Nobody? You have? So you know that form?
Similar form, yeah.
Similar or that form?
Describes the kind of activities that they can't.
That's not what I said. Here's why. This was not a trick question. That term, loss of enjoyment of lifetime, here's the deal. Loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities and duties under duress are activities of daily living. In other words, we're quantifying the restrictions and limitations of activities of daily living. Now, loss means the patient can't do that activity anymore. Loss, that's what loss, okay? Duties under duress means they can do it, but they have pain and restrictions doing it. So one, you can't do it. One, you have pain and restrictions. That's the difference essentially between those 2 categories. Number 1. And we're dealing with the second most important category of personal injury. Remember, what's the 1-2 punch of the personal injury award? What's the first thing that gets your award up? The impairment. What's the second one that's most important and valuable to a human being? Activities of daily living. That's where there's money. There's money in the things that are valuable that we need to do. And when we can't do them, that's worth a lot of money. Right? That's the 1-2 punch of personal injury. Right? What about the marathon runner who runs marathons for a living? They're sponsored by marathons. And now he's in an injury and he can't run marathons anymore. How valuable is that injury? That's a very valuable injury. Okay? Because it affected his livelihood. That's what his livelihood was, running marathons. Okay? Activities of daily living. Most of the time it's working, sleeping, bathing, showering, cooking, cleaning. I'll give you a clue. Remember that lady, that patient I told you that the patient I took from 0 to $110,000? Now, she couldn't bend over without there being pain and discomfort because of her injury, that I documented. But of all the things she couldn't do, the thing that she couldn't do that I think affected the jury the most, she couldn't bend over and pick up her 6-year-old child. How important is it, mothers, to be able to bend over and pick up your 6-year-old child? She couldn't do it. And I was able to explain to the jury every one of these categories and why she couldn't and why it was permanent the rest of her life. I was able to show everything. Subjective evidence, hybrid, and totally objective evidence. And that's what your doctors should be able to do. They should be able to document stuff like this. So We're back to loss of enjoyment lifetime activities. Here's the second reason. These are peer-reviewed diagnostics. What does that mean? Well, one of the 4 areas that they're going to try to contest is they're going to say it's not medically accepted. That's why everything the doctor needs to do is peer-reviewed and medically accepted. So guess what happens when you get hodgepodge activities of daily living that's not a peer-reviewed document? Are you with me? It can be easily attacked, number one. Also, these are impairment indexes. What does that mean, impairment indexes? This is given at impairment at MMI. In other words, this is permanent the rest of their life. Now, we'll do what's called functional capacity indexes. As we're treating the patient, we'll measure what they can and can't do with what's called functional capacity indexes. In the neck, the common one is called cervical disability index. In the low back, the common ones are called the Oswestry or the Rowland-Morris index. Now, those are functional capacity indexes. They just help us, the doctors, determine how well the patient's recovering. That's all, okay? It's another biometric. This is peer-reviewed. In other words, that's why, and it only is given after there's an impairment. So, when your doctor gives you your cervical sprain strain up here, right? You're 0 for 1. Number 2, is an impairment. Is cervical sprain strain an impairment? No. You're 0 for 2. There's no impairment. If there's no impairment, can you have loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities or duties under duress that are impairment indexes? By definition, you can't, because they're impairment indexes. You have to have an impairment to give it. Are you with me? So if you just get hodgepodge, some activities of it, because I get that, I know. Here's what typically I've found. Most attorneys don't get loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities from the doctors because they don't know how to do it. They'll get some phrases like kind of what he said. Yeah, my doctor will say something about restrictions of activities of daily living. It will not be a peer-reviewed, okay? And then the doctor will give a limitation for a certain period of time. You can't do that. An impairment is permanent. It's not a certain period of time. You get my point? Now, fortunately, most of the insurance companies really aren't bright enough to catch that. So most of the time, I have found the attorneys will get the doctor to give something about some type of restrictions with activities of daily living. But what I want you to know is if they're not using peer-reviewed material, that can be called junk science real quick if you have any kind of a smart attorney. And when that gets called junk science, guess how quickly that goes through your whole case? It gets through your whole case. So these are called impairment indexes, and you give them at the end. They're science peer-reviewed. Now, I'm going to give you the most important piece of the information now relative to this. Typically, if it is done, it's almost always you'll get what's called a lot of false negatives. In other words, you won't get a lot of positive findings. I'm going to share with you right now why your doctors are getting a lot of false negatives. In other words, these tests there's a lot more positive than what's being documented. But it's not being documented as positive. Now, if it's not being documented as positive, is that helping or hurting your injury award? That's hurting it, right? I'm going to share with you right now in this category why your doctors are hurting your injury award. This is inside information, by the way. 90% of the doctors that come to my seminars don't even know what I'm getting ready to tell you. Here's what they'll do. They'll take the form. What's your first name? Bob. They'll take the form and they'll say, Bob, go ahead and fill this out. That's what they'll do. Here's what you need to know. Each joint in your body has 3 ranges of motion, not 1. And this is unbelievably important for the soft tissue spinal injury. Because all the findings at MMI are not in the active range of motion category. So when you have doctors who are only doing diagnostics in the active range of motion category, they're totally missing the other 2 categories. And that's where the positive findings are. So there's 3 ranges of motion, whether it's the neck, the back, the elbow, whatever. The first one is called active range of motion. Okay? That's when you just kind of move like this. You control it. The second one is called overpressure motion. I can't control overpressure. Let me give you an example with my elbow. I can control active range of motion. So I'm going to bend my elbow. That's active gross range of motion, okay? That's one. Remember, there's 3 ranges of motion. Active range of motion is not where the positive findings are at 3, 6 months, a year later with a typical soft tissue injury. So if they're only doing diagnostics with active range of motion, guess what you're going to get with positive and negatives? You're going to get a lot of negatives. And how does that impact your injury award? It hurts it. Why? Because it doesn't exist? No. It overwhelmingly exists, but it doesn't exist in the active range of motion category. They did the wrong test. Remember, so you got active range of motion, this is overpressure. When I take my hand and push it, so in other words, it takes an external force to go further. That's where there's a lot of problems in the soft tissue injury. Then the third range of motion is called paraphysiological joint space or joint motion. Those are the 3 ranges of motion. Now remember that case I was telling you about I took from $0 to $110,000? The emergency doctor and a GP said she was normal. Well, one of the reasons they said she was normal is because she had normal active range of motion. So when I'm in front of the jury, guess what I told the jury? I said she did have normal active range of motion. Because she did. She could do active range of motion. What could she not do? Overpressure. Well, what took her into overpressure when she bent over? Lifting a laundry basket. That took her into overpressure. What else took her into overpressure? Picking up her 6-year-old child. It took her into. That's where that's where the pathology was. It was an overpressure and joint motion. It was not an active range of motion. They only did diagnostics for active. They totally missed doing any diagnostics for overpressure or joint motion. I did them all. I went and did them all. I went and did all of these, including overpressure and joint motion. And I showed the jury in all of these categories, subjective, including x-rays. And I showed the jury how the bones were moving and how they weren't moving. It was the gross range of motion was in her hips. She could move gross with no pain or discomfort, and that's real common with soft tissue spinal injuries. What they can't do is go all the way back or all the way this way or all the way that. That's what they can't do. And it becomes permanent. And I'll explain why here in just a little bit. They did the wrong test. You got to do the right test to get the right diagnostics. Here's what it's called: high sensitivity testing. You got to, in personal injury, especially soft tissue, you have to do high sensitivity testing. In other words, test where the injuries are. You can't do low sensitivity testing. In other words, common tests that are not positive 3 and 6 months later. Well, gross range of motion is commonly normal. Okay? Does that make sense? So be aware, there's 3 ranges of motion. The big problems are in overpressure and joint motion, not active range of motion. Active range of motion will almost guaranteed to be normal. And if your doctor is only evaluating active range of motion, you're stuck with normal again. How's that impacting your injury award? It's hurting you. So those are the 3 big those are the big takeaways with loss of enjoyment of lifetime activity, duties under duress. First, you have to do these forms, not just hodgepodge. Let me sketch together some activities of daily living, because these forms are peer reviewed. They've already been legally tested. Okay? They're called loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities, duties under duress. Number 2, you can only give them if there's an impairment. You got a doctor giving you these, and he did cervical sprain strain and there's no impairment? You can't do that. Number 3, when they are given, here's how I'm going to get the positive findings. When I hand it to Bob, say Bob's my patient, I won't do this, fill this out. I won't do that. Because Bob's just going to think 6 months later or a year later after an accident what he can do. And his gross range of motion is going to be pretty good. Here's how I'm going to get my positive findings on this test. I'm going to say, Bob, I want you to fill this out. It's going to ask you about very specific activities of daily living. And here's how I want you to answer each one of them. Now let's say with Bob, in his last exam, I knew that Bob had trouble with it going backwards in extension and overpressure. That was painful. When I took him in extension and overpressure, that was painful, okay? And by the way, that is real common with back injuries. And most of the injuries, the pain and restriction is in overpressure. Neck, same thing. So I'm going to say, Bob, here's how I want you to fill this out. When it asks you about this activity, I want you to answer it in the form of, can you do that activity bending backwards 100% with no pain or discomfort? That's how I want you to answer that question. Because if he didn't have a lesion and he was normal, that would be normal, wouldn't it? That should be normal if he didn't have a lesion, right? I'm not faking anything here. I'm digging to find the real problem is what I'm doing. Does that make sense what I just said? So now what happens? So now every time he looks at it, Bob goes, oh, can I do that doing this? Well, hey, no. That's how the doctors stop the false negatives. And that's why I said, when you have a doctor that knows how to document this, and in other words, he knows how to diagnose the number 1 and number 2 spinal injury, he knows how to give the impairment, he's going to know how to do what I just told you. So here's your cervical sprain strain doctor. Injury? No. Impairment? No. Loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities? No. You'll get some activities of daily living. You'll be 1 for 4. 1 for 4. So when you're 1 for 4, where's that injury award headed? No offer, low ball offer, high ball offer, policy limit award. Can you see how we're sticking in the low ball category? Now you have a doctor that does know. 80% of the injuries have altered intersegmental spinal motion. 25% LMSI. You got a 25% impairment or at least 12 to 15%. I'm 2 for 2, loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities. I'm going to measure loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities in overpressure, not active range of motion. I'm going to have positive finding, positive finding, positive finding, positive finding. Duties under duress, positive, positive, positive. I'm 4 for 4 because I did high sensitivity testing. And it was not taught in chiropractic school or medical school, just like you putting a personal injury case was not taught in law school. But attorneys don't know that. Attorneys don't know, most doctors don't know what I'm telling you. Just like when I graduated, I thought attorneys were the same. I thought you graduated from law school, you're all the same. You guys could probably laugh right now. You guys can go, oh man, there's attorneys I wouldn't even send my mother or brother to. You see what I'm saying? That's what happens with these cases. Let's go to number 5. Prognosis and need for future care. Prognosis and need for future care. Can you have a prognosis and need for future care if you do not have an impairment? No. So where you stand right now, Bob, with your cervical sprain strain guy? 1 for 5. You're 1 for 5. What's the bad news right now? You got 2 big, you're a personal injury attorney, you got 2 major problems right now. You got 2 huge problems. Who can see them? Who can see the 2 problems right now? Here's number 1. We're done with building the money. Remember? The top 5 categories are the categories that build the money. Defending it doesn't build money. It just helps keep the money that was built. You're done building the money. You're 1 for 4 and you're done building the money. How do you like that? That's what you're getting with your cervical sprain strain guys. I'm telling you, if you root it, that's the most common. You know, if I were going to tell an attorney, what's the number 1 clue? You have a doctor who doesn't know what he's doing and he's hurting your case and getting you stuck with low ball offers. By the way, do you have a chance? Do you even have a chance to come out of a low ball offer right now, Bob? No. You're done with the injury award category and you're 1 for 4. You're stuck here. What's the only thing you can do now? Beg and plead for the doctors to lower their bill. And is that why you went to school? Isn't that just fun? Don't it give you just like warm, fuzzy feelings to ask your doctors to reduce their bill because their documentation is so bad? And then they get mad at you. Isn't this crazy? They give you terrible documentation. Forces you, the attorney, into a low ball offer, right? Then you go back to the doctor, and you probably referred him the case in the first place, right? Watch how crazy this is. The attorney will refer the case to the doctor, let's say the chiropractor. Because he doesn't realize chiropractors are different with personal injury and what they can and can't do. So the doctor gives them the cervical sprain strain, 1 for 4 kind of category. Gets them stuck in the low ball category. And then you get a low offer, right? So for you to squeak out any money for yourself a little more for the client, you try to decrease the medical, Say, hey, doctors, can you lower your bill? Then the doctor gets mad at you, right? And you referred him the case in the first place, and he gave you crappy documentation to put you in that position. Is this crazy? That's what's going on. That's what's going on. You know what I would do? If that was me and I was an attorney, you know what I'd do? If I'm referring business to somebody, and he's giving me crap in return, you think I'm going to keep giving that person business? I'm going to send my business somebody that can do all this for me and stop giving me low ball offers. That's what I'm going to do. Common sense. So, remember I said there were two really negative things right now relative to your injury award. Number one, you're out of the injury drivers. You're 1 for 4 and you're out of building the money. That's number one. Here's number two. Remember we said there were 4 injury awards from the doctor's notes: medicals, impairment, pain and suffering, and prognosis. We're not looking real good with medicals now, are we? We don't have a lot of documentation. So now we're being stuck with a 2-to-1 ratio of medicals or less. Do you have an impairment injury award with your classic cervical sprain strain doctor? No. Cervical sprain strain is not an impairment. What did he just do to this injury award by not knowing how to diagnose the personal injury? What did he just do to you with this injury award, attorney? He just took it off the table. You can't even get this because there's no impairment now. Why? Because he didn't do the diagnostic test that shows the impairment 80% of the time. He just took off the table 1 injury award. It's actually worse than that. You'll have something for pain and suffering, not much, right? Based on what we just 1 in 4 of the financials. Can you have a prognosis and need for future care if you don't have a permanent impairment? What did that doctor just do to you because he didn't know how to document personal injury? How many of the injury awards did he just take off the table? 2. And one last piece about it. Of those 4 injury awards for the soft tissue spinal injury, which one is typically the greatest injury award? Attorneys? Huh? Nope. Prognosis and need for future care. Especially if it's a younger person, because they need care the rest of their life. So if it's an older person, 80 years old, they're not going to have much of a life expectancy for therapy. My patient was 33 years old. They'll go to an actuarial scale, look how long she's expected to live, and she needs that therapy till, I forget what it was, in her 80s, late 80s, something like that. That's the largest of the 4 injury awards, typically for the soft tissue spinal injury. And what just happened to it with your cervical sprain strain doctor, the doctor that did not know how to diagnose altered intersegmental spinal motion, ALMSI. You got cervical sprain strain, nothing for an injury. You got no impairment. He's taken 1 off the table. You don't have loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities. Typically, you will have some activities of daily living, and you'll have no prognosis. You'll be 1 for 5 in the financial driver category, and he's eliminated, which puts you into the low ball category. You're done building the injury award. Can you get out of this category at all from this point forward? No. We're done with the injury award. We're just going to defend now. We're done building it. You're now stuck permanently here. And what did he just do to your injury award? He took 2 of the 4 off the table. And of the ones he left, how healthy did he give them to you when you're 1 for 4 with medicals? 1 for 4 for pain and suffering. Who here can start to see They now are starting to understand why they're getting low ball offers. You see why? Can you see how it's not your fault? It doesn't matter how good of an attorney you are. Is there anything you could have done based on the doctor's documentation that I just said? Nothing. You're stuck. You only have one option. What is that? What's the only option you have to turn this whole thing around? Work with doctors that know how to document it. Yeah. That'd be like me choosing a personal injury attorney for my personal injury that never learned personal injury after law school. And I can't tell you how many attorneys are referring their cases to doctors that never learned how to do this. And they just think they're a doctor, so they know how to do personal injury. And there's a huge difference in what's called high and low sensitivity testing, and the categories to put the case together, how to defend it, how to deliver it. All that's learned and taught out of chiropractic college, out of medical school. And less than 5% of the population goes to learn it. Just like attorneys. There's probably less than 5% of the attorneys that actually take time out to actually go learn how to do personal injury. Is that a fair statement? Most attorneys don't do personal injury.